So the two of you have worked together for quite some time now. In fact, you're even leading a talk at Northwestern this evening, right?
We are.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that's about?
Yeah, you know, Greta, it has to do with the Nate Silver book, The Signal and the Noise. And, you know, in our line of work, we talk about computer models a lot and information like that. So Nate wrote a book on various forecasting, looking at economic forecasts, political forecasts, and he concluded of all the forecasting efforts in the country, weather forecasting is the one endeavor that's shown progress. And he said it's because we understand the uncertainty of it, the people in our profession, but he talks about climate change too, which is Don's area.
I was going to say the one thing he doesn't do well is his chapter in climate
change. Yeah. So we're going to talk about that tonight.
So obviously you two like each other pretty well.
We do.
Like you have a really nice rapport. I wonder, can you tell us, Tom, a little bit about how this partnership
Well, this is an odd collaboration that I never thought would happen, but it's been one of the happiest things in my entire career. I was at a conference and Don walked up to me. Don is a Nobel Prize winning climate researcher based at the University of Illinois. His background includes passage of the Montreal Protocol, which banned chlorofluorocarbon propellants in aerosol cans that were destroying our ozone layer. But Don has been a lead author for the United Nations IPCC reports, which are the seminal reports on climate change and the state of the science. And he came up to me and said, "Say, if you ever want to work on some projects together, I'd love to do that." And we later met each other at the Field Museum at a conference sponsored by our Tribune philanthropic arm, the McCormick Foundation, which brought media types in to meet real live climate researchers, you know. And the thing that strikes me in every presentation, I think it's good for people to see Don, who is a Southern Illinois farm boy without a political bent. It's amazing to me, and just an incredibly bright researcher who's done groundbreaking work in climate research.
Yeah, what you all don't realize is Tom has become my publicist.
I love this guy. It's a I've learned so much from Don.
So Don, what do you think helps in terms of your partnership with each other's expertise? Like, how are the two of you able to sort of feed off of the information that you've each spent your careers learning and researching?
Well, we both have degrees in meteorology. We just took different pathways in that. I look at the long-term changes, and Tom, of course, looks at what's happening with the weather systems. We're really looking at the solutions to the very same equations. It's just that we're looking at them in different ways. So the science takes on this progression going from weather to climate, and that's what makes this fascinating, because it allows us to then really deal with that whole change of time periods.
So Tom, what's your favorite analogy for describing the difference between weather and climate to help us understand what we're talking about?
Weather is the instantaneous state of the atmosphere. The climate is an average of those instantaneous states over an extended period of time. So that's why it's wrong to conclude in this era of talk of global climate change and global warming to take one cold wave, or as one of the senators has done, to throw a snowball on the Senate floor when there's a snowstorm, claiming that it's not supposed to snow or get cold during climate change. He clearly doesn't understand the basics of climate nor the difference between weather and climate. And I think my role is I reach an audience, and I have a following, and I try to introduce folks to the notion of climate change, because climate change is happening. It's real. We're paying cleanup. We're looking at cleanups as a result of extreme weather events that are increasing in number. And so I think I'm in some forums where I have a chance to present folks like Don to the public and say, look, you know, listen to what this man has to say. This is very important.
So Tom, you're one of the few meteorologists on TV who is willing to make the connection between weather and climate, to say, you know, this is extreme weather, this is probably a result of climate change.
Yes.
I wonder when you decided to kind of take that stand.
It didn't happen overnight. When I used to read that the Arctic was going to melt and so forth, I thought, boy, you're going to have to prove that to me. I just thought about the physics of the way the planet heats up. The fact we're on a sphere and that the polar regions are tilted away from the planet, go dark certain points of the year. I thought it's going to be a devil to get this area to melt. But the fact is, it is melting.
It's changing at twice the rate as the rest of the planet.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't know how you can look at the body of evidence that's out there today. The changes that are occurring at 10 times the speed of anything we've seen before. We have CO2 levels that are the highest in at least 800,000 years.
3 million.
And yeah, 3 million. If the oceans weren't acting as a giant sink to absorb carbon dioxide, we would have over 500 parts per million instead of the 405 parts per million we have now, which is an unheard of value. The oceans are warming up, they're acidifying, and I see as an operational forecaster evidence of strange weather patterns. For instance, pools of warm air that develop over the Arctic regions that produce what are called blocking patterns. I think of Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy. There was such a pool of warm air that developed over Greenland. We call that the Greenland block. And Sandy would have preferred following a climatologically favored path out to sea, but instead, with this big mound of warm air, turned inland toward the coast. So sea level is rising. You just go down the list. It's amazing what's going on.
Yeah, I grew up in Alaska, which is a place where it's very easy to see how much things are changing, to the point where like villages that used to be right on the coast, things are eroding so intensely that these people have to relocate where they live
because of erosion issues.
Right, because otherwise their town will just like fall into the Arctic Ocean.
Greta, I went up to Alaska in 1980 with a group junket. I've been going up ever since. And in that short period of time, the changes that have gone on in your home state are just stunning. They built a visitor center down the highway. It's called the Begich Boggs Center. Interesting, Begich was running for Congress, and Hale Boggs, was Cokie Roberts' father.
Yes.
And he was up to accompany Begich on campaign jaunts, and they crashed. Never found the bodies, never found the remains. And they built this center in the face of the Portage Glacier, which was visible from this beautiful auditorium where they show you this lovely film on the Chugach National Forest. And at the end, the curtains open, and you used to see the glacier. This was built in the mid-'80s. The glacier is no longer within view. It's melted back.
You can't see it.
That's such a fascinating representation, like the idea of literally opening the curtains and like, oh, there's no glacier there anymore. I mean, like you can't get more tangible in terms of like this is climate change, right?
Alaska has lost 320 trillion tons of glacial ice. Since 1994, they lose an average of 75 billion tons of glacial ice every year. In Greenland, 1 trillion tons of glacial ice melted from 2011 to 2014. There's been 9 trillion tons of ice, they estimate, that's been lost up there in the last century. That would be enough to submerge the entire United States interstate system under 60 feet of water 58 times, I think is the statistic.
Tom, how do you keep all these numbers in your head? Like, seriously.
You know what, I'll tell you, it's been years of reading. These are the factlets that we ought to be communicating to the public, because the public can grasp these. It isn't some distant sea level rise, or, when we say there have been 10, 500 to 1,000-year floods, each with billion-dollar price tags that the taxpayers of America are picking up to repair in the last year in this country, that has some meaning to people. And so I've always migrated toward these little facts when they're from credible sources like Don and the folks at NASA and NOAA. And this is why it scares the devil out of me, this defunding effort that's underway right now. This is absolutely the wrong time to be doing this sort of thing.
So the two things that really have the most impact on people from the concerns about climate isn't the increase in temperature by itself. More hot days are not good, but it's really the changes in severe weather and the changes happening in the oceans, particularly sea level rise. So I'm leading a special assessment of the science of climate change with a focus on the U.S. Right now for the government. And that study, our assessment, and I have 30 plus very top scientists around the country working with me, concludes that we can expect 1 to 4 feet of additional sea level rise this century.
Wow.
And we've already had 7 to 8 inches over the last century, but But that's not the end of the story. With what's happening in West and now East Antarctica, particularly, we can't say that 8 feet is not possible, which would, of course, put New York and a number of other major cities underwater. And for the US coastlines, because of the subsidence of the land and changes in currents that we expect that the net sea level rise to be even larger. On top of that 1 to 4 feet, another 1/2 to 1.5 feet over much of the U.S. coastlines. The exceptions being the Northwest and Alaska.
So Don, we have some very real scientific progressions then about like what could be happening. And I think now, more than ever before, we're able to make these connections between the extreme weather we're seeing and the fact that this is an indication of climate change.
Yeah.
And I wonder, in your role, how do you balance making sure people are aware that this is a very real problem that we need to address and not just freaking them out so much that they totally shut down and avoid the problem? You know, I think it's so easy. Like, this is a big problem, right? This is like a global issue.
It is a major problem. Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, even me personally, like thinking about like what can I do can be really overwhelming. What's your take on that?
So, first of all, former top research scientists, or the top scientist for the UK previously, I'm trying to remember his name.
Yeah, Sir David King.
King.
Yeah.
Couldn't remember. Yeah, Sir David King,
Yeah.
who both Tom and I know very well, stated at one point that climate change isn't one of the biggest problems of our time. It is the biggest problem of our time, because if we look forward and say, what does this mean to our children and our grandchildren? This is really important stuff. When we talk about the projections of climate change, you know, we've already seen on the order of about 1.6, 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature over the last century globally. Over this century, if we continue the pathway we're going, which is continuing heavily using fossil fuels, then we can expect another 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, it ends up the last ice age was about 13 degrees colder Fahrenheit than currently. And so it's a big deal. It really is, it's really very major. So I do a lot of public speaking on climate, and my last 2 slides are always about hope, because we can solve this problem. We just have to choose to do so, and we have to really understand how important this is to not only to our own lives, because we're already seeing major impacts. Just from severe weather events alone, over the last 37 years, we've seen an increase. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration tracks the billion-dollar events that happen. We've seen a huge increase in the number of such events over the last 37 years. They started in 1980 doing this. And such that we've had over $1.1 trillion of impact on the American economy because of those events. So this is already affecting your pocketbooks. It's affecting your taxes, you know, how your taxes are being used.
And you know, another thing, Don, what we see going on in Europe, this mass migration out of Syria, there is a climate angle to what's gone on in the Middle East. Yeah. This past summer, they had the hottest temperatures ever recorded. Baghdad went up to 127 degrees. In the last 2 months, the hottest temperatures ever recorded in Australia have occurred. Antarctica has had its warmest temperature on record there. But what happens is there was an incredible drought from 2006 to 2010 in Syria and the Middle East, which forced 1.5 million farmers off their lands into the cities that were ill-equipped to handle it. Now, that didn't directly lead to ISIS and all the rest, but the social destabilization that goes on is incredible, and the Pentagon looks at this a lot. Look at this resource grab that's going to start taking place up in the Arctic as the ice moves away, and you've already got this Russians staking out land out in the international waters as their own for oil extraction and stuff like that. You know, the Pentagon gets it. They have millions of acres on the coastlines. They're watching their Norfolk Naval Air Base go underwater on what are called sunny day floods. That's happening in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, the Chesapeake, and Potomac are flooding regularly during astronomical high tides. Miami has levied $400 million of new fees on residents there to raise roads, seawalls, and all the rest. And there's no indication they're going to be totally able to handle the flooding that occurs with higher sea level. So there are vast implications that ripple through everything we do, and the socially destabilizing aspects of it are scary. The Secretary of State Kerry said, if you think this migration from the Middle East into Europe and what it's doing to countries and the stability there is something, wait till it starts from Africa, because there are droughts going, not all of them human-induced, but Southeast Asia has some weather stresses going on. You're going to start moving mass populations into other areas because of lack of water resources or food. And the picture that you paint with that is even scarier than some of the physical damage that comes from storms.
Yeah, so what Tom is saying is that climate change adds to the other stresses that you already may be feeling in some location. And water throughout the world is likely to be
the new oil, right?
the other really major issue during this century and beyond. Such that as we look at the changes in climate, which are driving some areas to be drier and other places to be wetter, it's changing the whole dynamics of how water will have to be considered around the world.
So Don, you said that when you do presentations, your last couple of slides are about hope.
Yes.
This is dire stuff.
It is dire stuff.
Are you optimistic?
Yes. In fact, I was asked that question by an AP reporter at the White House when I was talking about the last National Climate Assessment. Says, how can you be optimistic about us doing this? Because I have to. I mean, it's important. We got to solve this problem. And Americans and people in general around the world are very good at problem solving. We can get this done. We just have to kind of stop some of this political stuff, because the science is very clear. There is no plausible explanation beyond humans driving our climate system over what's happened over the last century. There are no natural cycles. People constantly come up to me and say,
we've always had ice ages, yeah.
Can't you explain what this natural cycle? No, there are no natural cycles. So the science is very clear. There's been a published analysis say 97% of the scientists agree. In fact, if you looked at the other 3% of the papers, each of them this analysis has been done now too. Each of those additional papers that disagree has a fatal flaw in it that, if corrected, would make them agree as well. So there really is no alternative explanation and no alternative facts for climate change.
Greta, we've done, and just locally here at Argonne Labs, there are nanotechnologists there working on embedding solar collectors in windows down there. Dr. Seth Darling, who along with Doug Sisterson authored a book which I'd highly recommend. It debunks all of the myths about climate change, or many of them. It's called How to Change Minds About a Changing Climate. At any rate, Seth is a nanotechnologist, and they were showing me this panel embedded with solar panel. We will one day look through windows at the outdoors as clearly as we do now through glass, and these will be solar collectors working on it as we ought to be leading the world in those. You talk about jobs, there are more people working in non-fossil fuel jobs now, and it's the fastest growing energy sector than in the fossil fuel industry.
Now, you told me that earlier, and that kind of blew my mind. I had no idea.
Don has even more on that, but it's quite interesting, yeah. And what we ought to be doing, if we want to create jobs, is instead of buying turbines from France and solar panels from China, we ought to be making them in this country and leading the world in these new technologies and the new future fuels. Yeah. And that can be done.
There are new roofing materials also being developed that will be entirely, your roof will be a solar material.
Yeah.
And so you'll just replace your roof with this new material, and it will drive the entire energy system in your house.
Seth was telling me that you could embed the solar collectors in roads. and do away with having to snow plow because it would heat the roads, with solar energy and melt the snow that way. So,
well, that's good. So there are some things to be optimistic about.
Yes.
Anyway. But there is still a lot to think about too. We have just a couple minutes left, but I would love to open up the floor for questions, maybe over here.
Hi, it's Lydia Lazar from UIC's Great Cities Institute. Actually, my question is about the possible risks and benefits associated with planetary geoengineering and the sort of Snowpiercer dystopian future that I know scientists are always looking for technological solutions and wonder about the interest in that.
Okay. I didn't fully hear that, but I heard geoengineering.
Geoengineering,
which is something I'm really sensitive to.
Right.
In fact, I'm going to be moderating a special session at a special symposium on geoengineering this summer. From a scientist viewpoint, geoengineering, which is basically how do we apply technology to solve this problem? And there's several ways you can do it. One is to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, for example. And if we could develop a technique that was economic enough, that would be really useful. But it's not economic at this point. The other approach, which is much cheaper, is to try to reduce the amount of sunlight that comes to the Earth, so in a sense, cooling the Earth, by either reflecting sunlight, by taking advantage of particles in the atmosphere. The original idea was to put sulfur dioxide up in the atmosphere, in the stratosphere, and then you would, it turns into sulfuric acid particles, and those reflect sunlight. That's not such a good idea, because it would have other impacts that we would not want. And so the new designer particles will achieve some of that same effect, but hopefully without some of those repercussions. But there's so much we don't understand. So I think it's a good thing to do research on geoengineering, all geoengineering. But no one should be thinking about putting in an application. My greatest fear is that some rogue country or a group of countries gets together and says, well, we're going to do it anyway because it would help us. And that could be a major problem.
That's interesting. I think we have time just for one more question.
Hi, my name is Patrick Cerrone. I work for Curiosity.com. Great discussion. Thank you so much. You guys should go on a road show across the
Great
world
show, by
telling
the way,
people.
Jake.
Thank you.
Great show.
Thank you. My question is, so the information you gave to this audience, to me in particular, was just so valuable and great. I learned a lot. But it's a polarizing and political issue for a lot of people when you're speaking to general population. So what would be your recommendations for the right way to educate folks on this without making it too political or polarizing? What are the ways that you do that? Because you guys do it in a great way, very tactful. So just any thoughts on that and what we can do to share that information with others? Thank you.
So as Tom mentioned earlier, I'm a farm boy, but I often talk to farmers about climate change, particularly being at the University of Illinois, surrounded by cornfields. I get those opportunities. And I found, because many farmers tend to be conservative and tend to be Republican, that they've been kind of fed certain information. I don't even know where they get it from, but they have this idea that it's a hoax or whatever. And so I started talking to them about the things they observe. You're seeing more precipitation coming as larger events over the last 30 years. You've seen this increase. And they say, oh yeah, we're getting more fields flooded in the springtime. And so you see all these different things. You start talking to them about what they've observed, and then you turn it on them and say, well, that's climate change. This is one of those things we expect. And then you kind of get a conversation going.
Yeah, and I think the fact it's not at all bad news story, it doesn't have to be. I mean, there are things we can do. We could develop the industries of the future and employ Americans in the future with it. Maybe that's the tack we should take. I will say this, I think social media has been one of the headwinds we've had. While it's wonderful and has spread all kinds of knowledge, you have people on there, the mythology that spreads on social media and trying to unscramble the scrambles is pretty hard to do, and I don't know how you address all that. So I suspect we're going to have to live for a certain period of time with this highly polarized view of the subject and all, and we're going to have to deal with that. We just hope at some point facts prevail. And unfortunately, it seems like we need disasters sometimes to convince folks that we really have a problem. I You know, we didn't properly fund operational supercomputing capability till Sandy went in, and the European model got it going in before our model did. It wasn't that we had dumb scientists. The government had not provided the supercomputing infrastructure that we needed to run operational models of a resolution that the Europeans were running. Sometimes when horrible things happen, people react, but the problem is when horrible things start to happen, there are tipping points you reach. James Hansen talks about that. And the system will begin to spiral out of control on its own. At that point, we're beyond the point where we can intervene and do anything. So education, I think, is, you know, as frustrating as it can be sometimes, is probably the best way to approach it.
Yeah, Tom, can you remind us what that book is called too? That sounds like a
How to Change Minds on Our Changing Climate. It's an easy read, done by two Argonne scientists. It's wonderful, and
they do a nice job.
They do.
Great.
And it's done.
Your homework.
It's done eloquently. No name calling. It's just science.
One quick mention: 170 plus. I think it was like 174. Companies, major companies in the United States, made a commitment during the Obama administration to do something about their emissions on climate and how, you know, both adaptation and mitigation over this coming decade. And they're continuing with those commitments. So there are things in place. It just has to continue to build. And we can solve this problem.
That's a good motivational note to end on. Tom, Don, thank you so much.
Greta, thank you.